Welcome to FineWineToMe, the wine business podcast. Let's go today with port and port wine around the world. And who else could I ask for this podcast than Adam, my friend, who is also a port wine educator. He's also Hungarian, but this time we're obviously going to talk in English because that's an easier way to approach this subject. Welcome, Adam, and please introduce yourself because that's probably the easiest way.
Hello, 𝘱𝑒𝑏, and everyone who's watching the podcast. It is my pleasure to be here, so thanks for having me. And for no other subject than my favorite one, port. So hope everybody's ready for the next 3.5 hours of talking about port. No, just kidding. Probably it will be slightly less than that. But it will be filled with fruit and alcohol and fun, as a good port talk should be. I am, as 𝘱𝑒𝑏 mentioned, a port wine educator in general, wine lover, certified port geek, and also the UK ambassador for School of Port, the educational platform about port wine by the Portmat people from Portugal. And yeah, this is me in a nutshell, and I hope I can tell you all about port and what you want to know, what you don't want to know. So just go ahead, 𝘱𝑒𝑏, shoot.
Yeah, I think the 3.5 hour limit is probably not enough when it comes to port and when it comes to you at the same time, because I think you can talk about this forever. But anyway, let's aim for the 3.5 minutes. Sorry, that's not the right amount. Let's aim for maybe 45 minutes to an hour, and then let's see how it goes. So obviously we talked about this before, not once, not twice, probably quite a few times. But I think for anyone who is a listener, I am assuming that you know what port wine is, but if you're not, Adam will tell about this a little bit. And also my first question would be really how port wine is viewed in Portugal and internationally at this day of age, and then maybe a bit of a historical reference wouldn't hurt in this case.
So just to first clarify what port wine is. So port wine is a sweet fortified wine from the northern part of Portugal, which is the demarcated region of the Douro Valley. And port is either aged at the destination where it's made or in Vila Nova de Gaia, opposite Porto, by the Atlantic Ocean, where the river meets the ocean, effectively. And this wine has a history of over 3 centuries, which explains its relevance to the fine wine category, and also shows a certain amount of challenge to relate it to the 21st century and the new generation of wine drinkers. Most notably, it is a fortified wine, meaning in order to preserve the natural sugar content, high alcohol spirit was added to the wine during fermentation, roughly about to contain half the amount of natural sugar in the wine. Hence, by law, port is between 19 and 21% alcohol. By the sound of it, it's a lot. But if you come to think of it, there are certain red wines with 14, 15, or even 16% alcohol that are not fortified. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not extremely strong. And if you look at the competitive market, where it also has to compete with spirits and luxury brand spirits, cocktails, spirit-based cocktails, it is really just half the alcohol that you would see in whiskey, vodka, gin, per se.
So technically, you can drink twice as much, right?
It's one way to approach it, or the other way is to think of it as like it's a healthier option than the double strength spirit. And I'm sure that we will talk about it a bit later, but its relevance to the 21st century is obviously how you would relate this to the new generation of wine drinkers who are much more health conscious than let's say millennials or even before generation X.
Yeah, so I was gonna very briefly mention this before, that you're not supposed to hurt millennials here, because I am one, but obviously you are one as well. So
and me too. Although I think millennials, by definition, should start 1984 and beyond. But I think we are both borderline between Gen X and millennials.
Yeah.
Considering the fact that we are using technology right now instead of sending letters via Royal Mail, I think we are definitely steering towards the more tech-savvy generation. But yes, we are definitely millennials. But there's a huge difference. And just going back to your question in how port is viewed in Portugal and nationally, port is inherently a Portuguese product, very deeply rooted in its culture. So culturally and economically, it's very important for Portugal. It's still currently just over half of the entire wine export. No, it's actually now below half of it. It's just like 40%.
Still a staggering amount if you consider how many other wine regions Portugal has, actually.
Yes, and 10 years ago it was actually 60%, and its decline is not because port is no longer popular. It's that Portugal does an extremely good job about popularizing and streamlining their fantastic wines, by the way. So Portuguese, non-fortified Portuguese wines are getting more and more popular and widestream around the world. Hence, it's getting more important in their Portuguese exports. But port wine is still a huge chunk of it. So economically, it's a large factor in Portugal and Portuguese economy. And culturally, as I mentioned, although port wine is always looked at as its history is rooted in the story of two very commercial-minded seafaring nations, which is England in one hand and basically Great Britain, and Portugal on the other, as well as many other nations that were involved in the port trade, but less affecting its future at the time. British influence, you can find it on many of the large brands, where you can look at the bottle and it sounds very English for a reason, because many of the oldest port houses have English and Scottish origins. So this is an advantage as well as a disadvantage for future drinkers and popularizing the drink among the future wine drinkers. But the way it's viewed in Portugal is still a very important domestic market for port wine. So there's loads of it consumed locally. Whereas internationally, there are certain markets that are more important than others. But among the historical markets, which I'm sure that we'll go into a little later, there are new and emerging markets, and not just demographically, but also geographically.
That was my next question, really. The key markets for port wine and port wine houses really around the world, because obviously, as you say, export is the percentage of port wine export is declining. However, port wine export isn't declining on it.
No. So what happens with port wine is, with the change of demographics and demand from certain demographics, the type of port wine that's exported changes. There is a significant amount of moving towards the more premium segment, premiumization, if you want to use that very strange word for that. So, for example, Britain has always been a key market for port, but for centuries, Britain was mostly premium, which means reserved and more aged wines, and probably mainstream ruby. So we're talking about ruby ports, vintage ports, versus tawnies and white ports. So this is historically right, but with the change of demand on port and the fact that there are a whole other types of ports available, is a key opportunity for port houses to communicate with a newer generation, a newer audience of port wine. So just to give you an idea, United States and other English-speaking countries are also very important, but they don't have the historical link, so they are more open to other types of wine other than premium aged, higher priced examples.
Yeah.
And they are also open for other types of port, tawnies, whites. Interestingly, the most significant market in terms of volume is not the UK, but for many years now it's France.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But
That's
the France, French beat us to that, sadly, for centuries. For decades now. But the interesting thing is that the way they consume port is different. So they are predominantly, I don't like the word entry level, but it's the more straightforward, less complex expressions of port wine.
Let's call it entry level. Okay, yeah. I think that we can agree with that.
The ones that you would enjoy as an aperitif, because this is exactly how, in general, French market consumes a large amount of fine ruby, fine tawny, predominantly tawny. Interestingly, they prefer the nuttiness, the sort of caramel-led flavors as opposed to the fruitiness.
Yeah, I mean. It's quite interesting what you're saying about France, because I think I wouldn't expect a nation who produces the most wine around the world to be an importer of one of these neighboring countries.
For historical reasons, they often had to import, whether it was phylloxera and they were running out of their own wine, or whether it's the popularization of something other than their own wines. Although most wine regions that are significant in terms of wine making, countries like France, they are very protective of their own market. Yet the fortified wine market isn't as important for France. I mean, you've got the some fortified examples from France, but definitely port. It's next door to them, effectively. So it was very easy to import port wine as an aperitif, and it's still half the strength as cognac or any brandy. So that will still leave plenty of room for drinking your favorite white and red.
And potentially, quantity-wise, there's a lot more availability than, for example, Murray or some other sweet fortified wines produced in France itself. So I suppose it makes absolute sense to them to have it. But on a slightly different note, I believe there's another very interesting market for port is Asia, and it's partly because of its cuisine and the style, but partly because of the traditional style of consuming wine. It's more of the sweet style what they require in the Asian market. Is that right?
Yeah. So the characteristic of Asian market is very interesting. There's plenty of drinkers. There's plenty of people there, and their cuisine throughout the Asia Pacific market, it uses spices, uses ingredients that are typically very difficult to pair with wine. And culturally, pairing wine and food isn't really ingrained, but this is something that they generally, that market looks at the Western way of life as an interesting example that occasionally they like to follow as a trend, as they like, and then apparently wine drinking is one of them. But then yet they still struggle to find the right wines. And let's be honest, it's not just port that works very well with Asian cuisine. Most off-dry, semi-sweet wines can provide a very nice match. Either if we go to Alsace, the German Rieslings, Tokaj, not to go too far from Hungary. So these all have their chance in the Asian cuisine. But obviously port producers are very aware how important that market can be.
I was gonna ask the next question last, but actually, I just probably gonna bring it forward a little bit, because I think it makes perfect sense at this stage that in terms of sweet and fortified wines, how would you position, or where would you compare, or differentiate, port to other wines such as Madeira, sherry, or we mentioned dessert wines like Tokai, Sauternes, or sweet Rieslings?
They are surprisingly complementary, if you come to think of it. I often have this question at port wine masterclasses, like, what's the difference between Madeira and port? And my answer is normally almost everything.
Yeah.
Because the only thing that's common is that it helps if you speak Portuguese, because Madeira is part of Portugal.
It's Portuguese, yeah.
And that they are both fortified. But that is the end, because the differences are endless. And without being too technical, it's just Madeira is predominantly white wine, whereas port can be white or red. The wine making method is completely different. Madeira is legendary about being indestructible, which is true to certain categories that are more aged. Because there's barely anything that so basically there's nothing that you can do to that wine that hasn't been done throughout the aging. But the way they fortify it is different, and their ageability is somewhat different, and the way they taste is very different. Acidity levels are different, sweetness level is different. How they complement each other? Well, first off, Madeira, we're talking about 4,000 hectares of wine. The end. That's all the wine. That's all the area that's under wine.
Yes.
Versus,
and it's not going to be more either.
44,000 hectares in the Douro Valley.
Yeah.
So the availability is key. So Madeira is never bound to be mainstream. It's always remains almost like a boutique wine compared to almost any other wine region.
Yeah.
And with sherry, that might be comparable, although not in size. But how sherry complements port is that, despite of what the British market used to think about sherry and Bristol cream in that mesa, it's predominantly dry. So if you are looking for a dry fortified wine, sherry is the place to go.
Yeah.
And it isn't necessarily dessert wine, as much as I always believe that sweet wines aren't always meant for dessert. So they are perfect to pair with savory food, as it has been done actually for centuries before sugar became mainstream and available to every household. It was quite natural to enjoy sweet wines alongside your dinner, whatever was served. And if you think of some of the classic British foods like curry, for example, curry is a nightmare to match with wines unless you have some residual sugar. So curry and Indian food in general loves a bit of sugar with good acidity to cut through the sauce, and with those overpowering flavors. So dessert wines, again, in one hand they are complementary because they have different flavor profile. Let's look at Tokai. With its beautiful peachiness, apricot, pear, that's completely different to what port can deliver, either on the tawny side with dried figs and caramel, or on the vintage port side, which is full of red and black fruit. So I do believe it's complementary, and I think that every marketer should say, like, yes, please buy only my wine, but that would be ridiculous to suggest for people that drink nothing else but this or that product. I believe we all must appreciate the fact that we live at a day and age where it has never been such an amazing quality of wine available at such an amazing price in such a wide variety than today. We are indeed living in a golden age of wine.
Yes. I'm actually also curious. I don't know if you have any sort of notes or knowledge or recent data about, in terms of in terms of percentage of sales per year, for example, or generally percentage of sales compared to port with all the other sweet and fortified wines? Because I assume in the UK, port is still the major choice of drink when it comes to Christmas, because that's,
Yes,
that's
it's,
another.
it's one of the key challenges of port. I mentioned at the beginning that it's an advantage and a disadvantage all at the same time. So what port suffers from in the UK market is there are about 5 key associations with port wine.
Yeah.
And one of them is that it's a festive wine. So people often think that because it's a Christmas tradition, they don't dare to touch port at any other time but Christmas.
It's very strange, isn't it? I mean, when you consider how they view this in Portugal at home, which is technically it's even a warmer country than England.
It is, but then we have those traditions. So, for example, one of the things is that most British people, when I say port, they say cheese.
Yeah.
And they almost feel like it's not right to open a bottle of port unless you have cheese with it. So that's one of the association, which relates to one particular deeply rooted sort of behavior or cultural, culturally ingrained act. But it doesn't take into consideration like how many different ports do we have, and we have summer and spring and autumn, or at least we used to have. So port, because as I said, it's predominantly red and predominantly vintage here in the UK, and it's predominantly Christmas, and it's normally associated with cheese, and anything beyond that. And there are also some negative context where port is mentioned. This is something that I wrote my essay when I did my port wine educator certificate, is that they associate it with posh and boring and rich people. So they somewhat almost like a mockery of it. You must be rich and a Tory supporter to drink port, which is weird. But there are many of tweets and comments on socials about that. And the other thing is that they definitely associate it with old men. So it's like the old, clubbable, jovial person, normally wearing a dark suit and a tie, and at the age of somewhere between 75 and death. And because of that, young people would choose other drinks without actually thinking about like what else there is within the category, because it's an easy and quick thing to do, to find alternatives.
Yeah. As you mentioned, it's very much viewed as an old man's drink, and it's very much in the same sort of bucket as Bristol cream sherry in many ways. When people think about port, maybe Bristol cream sherry has a little bit less disposable income attached, but that's another very rude and slightly chauvinistic view of these drinks. But I think you right about the fact that actually port is very much viewed as an old man's drink. It's an old style. However, when you think about it, white port has many different interesting options how you drink it. So just on its own, or white port and tonic, or any other sort of port cocktails which you can create. There's rosé port as well, as far as I know. At least I tasted one. And
this remains a small category, but it's one of the ways the port market responds to changing demographics and changing demand. If we just stick to the UK as our home country, up to probably the 1970s, wine merchants and wine importers had no idea what to do with tawny port. They knew it existed because white port and tawny port, alongside their ruby brethren, were there for centuries.
Yeah.
Except that in this market, no one knew what to do with it. It wasn't fruity. It was more caramel, toffee, dried fruit. That was weird. And the color wasn't right. It was like dark. It's amber. It's brown. What are we going to do with it? They had no idea how to sell it. Therefore, they never bought it.
Yeah.
But then in the 70s, what changed in the UK is that the new generation came to drinking age. And they were in the search for something that's less time-consuming, more readily available than vintage port, something that you don't have to store for 2 decades in order to reach its peak drinking condition, and something that you don't have to decant. There were loads of rubbish about like how to decant port. It was all the mystery built around it, that you have to use a candle behind it and say a few prayers and always turn towards port and whatnot. So it was all creating a demand for something more readily available. And at that time, there were 2 options: either vintage port or the very entry-level fine ruby, which even back then was associated with more like drinking port and lemonade in the pub, which was mostly looked at as a women's drink. So something needed to create a bridge, and this is when new categories like Ruby Reserve, like LBVs, especially the modern style, fined and filtered LBV, ready to drink.
This is what I'm drinking today.
And so am I. Cheers to that.
Cheers.
I have a 2018 LBV from Cobburn's, and this is why these drinks came to existence. And with all the changes, and especially 90s and the early 2000s, this is when even this was not enough. When new people were, especially because going to Portugal became more and more available, although it's always been a very popular holiday destination for Britons. Alongside Spain, the Iberian Peninsula has always been very popular among British holidaymakers. Yet, moving towards just one particular very warm area, the Algarves in Portugal, younger backpackers started to favor less visited, more off the beaten track areas. And the Douro is definitely one of those. Just in case any of the listener hasn't been to the Douro, please Google it. It's one of the most rugged but most breathtaking terrains that you can find. And in brackets, this is where about 60% of the steepest mountain vineyards in the world is situated. So it's a rugged terrain, very hard work, but it's beautiful. And it used to be a very backward country. Some farms, some quintas didn't have electricity until the 1980s. So this is indeed the place to get away from it all, or it used to be, at least back in the 80s and the 90s. But with as a destination, holiday destination, that opened up a whole new association with port wine. Whoever visited Porto and tasted port wine there and saw how Portuguese people enjoy their port, their tawnies, their white port on its own or in a cocktail, will never look at the category the same way. And most of the chatter online, at least a couple of years ago, when there was a study made by an American company, it showed that that's the number one conversational point when it comes to port wine online is a visit to Portugal and all the memories that they bring back from there.
So, and on that note, obviously, this is one way of connecting wine drinkers with a potential new category of drinks, obviously, as well, which I wanted to do a little bit of chat about this a little bit later as well. What else is available in terms of how to future-proof a region or a style? It's not just obviously wine tourism, but there are other options: communication, education, potentially alternative packaging, obviously a lot more use of social media and digital marketing in the future. But I think just going back to the point before is in port itself, or in Portugal itself, people drink white port like you would drink any other type of white wine here, for example. But they also would drink, some of the red ports as well, chilled, on a summer day. How can we still not approach this in 2023 with a different mindset in the UK?
Well, because change takes time, and that gives me plenty of work for the years to come to start with. Because talking about port and running port wine masterclasses, this is our major job, and this is the major marketing challenge for port houses, is to understand port drinkers, understand the key challenges, and future proofing, if you ask me that, is something that port wine makers are very good, because you can't really stay in business for 100, 150, occasionally 200 years unless you understand that whatever you do now, it must anticipate what your future customers will want. You can't just sit on your laurels because you are in a peak season. Sherry is a very good example for that. They are still struggling with sales numbers after 2.5 decades, or nearly 3. They are getting there, but it was a major challenge. Port houses try to avoid that, and they were quite lucky in terms of the key markets and the traditions that I mentioned, occasionally in a negative light, but those are the strengths that you can build as long as you are open for the future and understand like what Gen Z, for example, would like from their drink in general. Is it health consciousness? Is it sustainability? Is it a different design? Because what was attractive to my father's generation may not be attractive to my children's generation. I think it's quite easy to see. There are plenty of things that port winemakers do in order to ensure that they meet the sort of like the interest of their target group. But your question was really about not just how to future-proof the region, but why don't we drink port the way the Portuguese do? Because they are Portuguese, and sadly we don't a lot. So that's one of the key reasons. But obviously, this is the direction that we would like to steer the port drinkers of the future, because this is exactly what port wine is made for, with all the varieties, with all the versatility. It provides a lot more than just sitting by the fire, having a deep conversation with someone while sipping your port. They talk about politics and all that nonsense. There's more to it.
But in that sense, obviously we're talking about port, and it has at least it has a backbone where they can build on. So the backbone, you can say it's, they will always sell plenty of port around Christmas, which is perfectly fine. And you mentioned that they try to steer things towards the new generation. Do they do it quick enough, though? That's my question, because I think, as you mentioned, Sherry as a comparison, who struggled quite a bit with, creating a new way of communication towards the new generation of wine drinkers to understand what Sherry is about.
No.
Does port do enough to create this?
I believe so. And just on a note, that Sherry doesn't struggle with communication. Sherry is brilliant in communication. What they struggle with is sales and sales numbers.
Now they are, but in about 10 years ago, they still weren't on the edge of the new technology.
They were the first to actually start communicating in a way that was market leading at the time, and then basically proved to be the right way to approach people, is through education, through fun, through informal communication. If you look at Sherry Academy online, that's a perfect example of how to do that. Another example on the port side is School of Port, where the basic message is port wine is fun, it's versatile, and it's good for any occasion.
Yeah.
If you want to know more, look at the people, look at the place. It's very original. It's got loads of story to tell you, and storytelling is key.
Yeah.
Always mention history, but we always mention that port wine is for every occasion to start with. And because of the versatility of the product, some are good for celebration and some are good for everyday enjoyment. But then basically, going back to the communication question, I do believe there's plenty more to do. But the quickness, that's something that I somewhat struggle with, because we live in a world where everything happens so fast.
Yeah.
Everything you can get in an instant. If you want to watch a film, you click on Amazon, it's with you.
Yeah.
On the instant. We got used to instant gratification, really. Whereas winemaking is never about instant results, and wine sales, of course, wine merchants would disagree with that because they have to maintain a business. But if you come to think of wine culture and culture generally, it's a slow burning thing. It's always about creating a connection, and it doesn't happen overnight. So if the question is, are they quick enough? I think they will respond to these challenges in time with the right speed. It will not happen overnight.
Yeah.
You can't and you shouldn't try to create a cultural bridge overnight, because that, it's a deep human connection that will always take time. There's a reason why they say that winemaking really is, if you are a winemaker, you don't measure your success in years, you measure it in generations. Really.
Yes. That's absolutely true. Although on the previous episode, which you obviously didn't see, because when we recording this, the previous episode hasn't been put on YouTube or any other platforms yet. But on a previous episode, I was talking to another wine professional about this, just a little bit more generally terms, in terms of how the wine trade generally, or the wine industry generally, is a slow burner in terms of not just in terms of production, but also in terms of responding to challenges, responding to time. It obviously came up in the discussion of partly social media and artificial intelligence, because that's the example I brought up in that conversation is some of the French chateaux in Bordeaux, for example. I try to look them up online from time to time for work, and they don't have social media platforms, and some of them don't have a website, which is for me, it's either very futuristic approach, because they just skip this 20 to 30 years of gap, having a website, because they just straight on jump onto artificial intelligence, or they very backward thinking because they still didn't get to this age. But in a more generic term, wine is very slow, very much of a slow burner. But in many ways, I think port, sherry, and Madeira, for example, but Madeira is probably not the right example, but port and sherry, in many ways, is coming from a bit of a disadvantage, because it doesn't have that general all year round sale internationally, where other wine regions or wine companies do.
That's true, but then it's also one of the challenges that they have to address, because everyone would like to have an all year round sales. And to be entirely honest, apart from the UK market, that's the Portuguese market, for example, which is still by far the biggest. So it's bigger market for Portugal, the domestic market, the port wine, than the UK. It is an all year round product. It's just different types of product. They are more tawny and white and less aged products. So reserved and 10-year-old when it comes to tawny, and not the 40, 50-year-old that is more popular here, or the 20 or 30-year-old at that. But it's, if you look at the history of port, which goes back to 300 years, the past 40, so it's less than 10% of its history, brought more changes than the previous one combined. In terms of creating new categories, in terms of revolutionizing the winemaking process, changing the viticulture, adapting new technology, adapting research from the 1980s and the 90s onwards, varietal planting, new types of terracing, using computer in terms of calculating when to harvest, how to harvest. It's just fascinating how much they changed. And there are indeed winemakers in Portugal and in port wine who actually invest in research, invest in the land, invest in the people who work the wines to ensure that there is a future on the production side. And they are the ones who invest in preparing the market for the future. And that is not just following trends of going for more sustainable bottling, or looking at using cans, or entering into the canned wine or canned cocktail market, changing the branding, but also providing education free of charge, like School of Port, like Sherry Academy, and the likes, because that is the key to educate. Because people will not know to buy a different type of port unless they know about the existence of it. So that is key to educate not just your current consumers, but also the future consumers, as well as trade professionals who will create that once very important gap. But with the sort of social media, immediate availability of accessing information about what you drink, even consumers are very quick to try to find out what they are exactly drinking, what's the story behind it, how healthy it is, how is it made, is it sustainable, is it organic, is it natural. So as long as all these come together, there is future for that wine category, and port is definitely there. There's a lot more to do, don't get me wrong, but the seed is there.
Yes.
The new generation of winemakers are there for a new generation of consumers.
Yes. And before we move on to the sort of the almost like a last question, I think in that sort of discussion, obviously you work with School of Port, which is an educational body. It's funded by one of the port houses, Symington's, in port. And obviously you work with them quite a lot, and this is partly the reason how we actually met, although we are both from Hungary. But this is potentially one of the reasons why we met, and we did a bit of a collaboration. So the T-shirt what you're wearing is actually from me, and I think this is a good time for me to chuck in my little promo here. So if you don't mind, guys, just bear with me for half a minute here. Hey guys, welcome. It's still me, Csaba. Thank you for your patience. I am the podcast host and the founder of FineWineToMe.com, a wine business consultancy based in London. However, at this second, I'm here to promote my side hustle, which is Daddy Wine Club, which is a sustainable fashion brand for wine lovers. We create all these amazing hoodies, t-shirts and jumpers for wine lovers, and really for anyone who loves these products. So please, if you can, have a look at daddywine.club. This is the website, and check out if you like something there. Thank you for your patience, and let's get back to the podcast right now. Because I think what I wanted to mention about School of Port is something which I really admire, actually, because I think obviously they need the backing of a fairly wealthy port producer who is willing to take on this massive task to communicate for the new generation of wine drinkers. And then I think it's a good way for you to introduce as well a little bit how School of Port actually operates and what they do, and how they change the communication to reach a wider audience.
So School of Port, although I am very proud of the fact, and School of Port is very proud of the fact that it came to existence in 2020, so it's fairly recent, funded by the Symington family estate, who are one of the biggest private landowners in the Douro, and who are guardians of making port for 5 generations, for over 100 and something years, back from the mid 1880s. And currently led by the 4th and the 5th generation of 𝐁𝐮𝐬𝐬𝐬𝐬, and they own certain brands over the centuries. They acquired 𝑑ow's, 𝑣aux's, Graham's, Coburn's as a latest acquisition. But what School of Port does is absolutely brand independent. So what we promote is port wine, the category, the terroir, the people, the land, its future, and we do it in an informal way, to make sure that the message gets through the barriers of all the 5 key associations that I mentioned before. And it's not UK focused, it's worldwide, and it's available free of charge. And if you come to think of it, 2020 as a date, it will always remain a year that will not bring back nice memories. It's certainly not a year when you want to start a new venture, unless it's for sort of like somewhat related to pharmaceuticals.
Yes.
But 2020, when School of Port started, there was no opportunity for face-to-face masterclasses, but online there were Instagram lives, interviews, plenty of data, infograms. We created video educational series. There are currently 2 series, and then now the 3rd one is a French speaking version of the Essentials. So we've got the Essentials and the Masters. The Essentials is 16 episodes of 3 4-minute videos about the basics of port wine drinking, and port wine and how it's made, and how it's aged, and how you can pair it with food, and all the specs. And the Masters is slightly up the notch, building on that with 5 episodes, slightly longer, about half-an-hour episodes. And there's a free opportunity to test yourself and get your certificate of being a certified port geek. And it's all done in a very useful, innovative way, which I think is a lot of people can relate to it. And gradually, I think that our audience grows, especially since 2022. I did the first School of Port masterclass with no other than yourself, actually, in collaboration with a wine bar that you were looking after at the time. And then throughout 2023, we reached consumers through wine schools, running masterclasses in wine schools, professionals and future professionals in relevant colleges and university courses in London, and we actually closed the year running a masterclass in Plumpton College, which I'm especially proud of, because Plumpton is the sanctuary in Britain for higher education in wine. So this is the path that we're looking at. So we are reaching out to consumers, professionals in the trade, and future professionals to make sure that they are actually in the knowledge that port wine is a lot more than your red wine for Christmas that's been in the cupboard for years.
Ages. Yeah. Yes, exactly.
So School of Port has plenty of ideas and plans for the future. So you can definitely stay tuned. We are on Instagram. And we have our website with the aforementioned videos.
Yes, I will put everything into the show notes on YouTube as well to promote School of Port as much as possible, because I think it's a great it's a great innovation, I would say, because I believe this is something what port generally needs. And I really like the style, that it's informative, but yet it's laid back. It's easy to understand. It's also easy to digest, especially not just for a wine professional, because even for a wine professional, sometimes it can be very tricky when you think about sherry, when you think about port and Madeira and all the styles, how they make it and everything. That's complex enough. But for a young wine drinker who is only a wine lover, really, then it could be an even more challenging journey to go through the certain types of port and how they make them and everything.
I have a very good example for that in terms of the challenges and the different. There's a wide variety of people that we can reach out to, but that requires slightly different communication. Should be always informal and easy to use, but I am very easy to prompt into geeking out about soil types, terracing, and all that, because it's exciting. I love it. Most consumers are not interested, especially the younger. We're talking about early 20s. So, for example, I loved Plumpton because I had nearly 3 hours, and actually we did more than 3 hours of geeking out about everything there is to know about port wine. Most of the students are actually studying for their WSET diploma. So we could go beyond the level of explaining what fermentation is, etc. We could actually go into the more nitty-gritty of port wine and port wine making. On the other hand, last week there was a fantastic pop-up at the London Christmas market by Waterloo on the South Bank by Coburn's Port, and I was invited by one of the port wine. The importer of Coburn's is 𝘱𝐻𝐿𝐴𝑍, Johnny 𝘱𝐻𝐿𝐴𝑍, and I was invited as a port wine educator to train the bar staff for the 4 days of serving fantastic port and port concussions like mulled port, hot chocolate with port and fish cocktail, and straight serve Cobburn special. And it was interesting to see that there were 3 young, lovely people. And my first question, I wanted to ask, like, guys, have you ever, which port is your favorite? But then I thought for a second, hold on a second, guys, have you actually ever tasted port? And the answer was, no, we haven't. So I had about an hour to not necessarily turn them into port experts, because that was not possible, but to install some sort of enthusiasm into their hearts. And I think that by the end of that hour, thanks for the Coburn's Port at hand, we had a lively discussion about like where port wine comes from, what it evokes in people, if they taste, what they feel about it, why they never touched it, do they have any assumption about port wine. And by the end of the hour, they actually, 2 of the girls were actually starting to plan their port and cheese tasting for later on, which I was very happy to hear. And all the guys there, they formed a bridge with the product. They formed their own opinion, because it's a very Gen Z thing that they were very quick to form opinions. And they even told me, which I certainly hope that they later told the consumers as well, is like why they like this port and why they like that port, what they thought this port will be good for them, and what the other port they think is better for. And that's exactly what we needed. And I went back to double check on them actually on Saturday, and I'm happy to report that this pop-up Port Lodge was very busy, and they were very enthusiastic, and it had a very, very good vibe. And I think this is crucial for the future of port. First, to make consumers understand that there's a lot to love, whether you have previous assumptions or not. And then, if they willingly want to learn more about it, make it available easily. And on a click, basically. So that's the key. Not just having a website, but having an immediate, reliable source for consumers.
Yes, exactly. I completely agree. And then sometimes I feel it's more important to have fun with wine than just all the knowledge, because the knowledge you will never be able to actually gain all of them, because there's always something to learn about. But as long as you have some sort of fun and engagement and enthusiasm and a bit of cheekiness coming with wine, I think this is the main element when you can start telling confidently what you like, why you like it. And essentially wine is a very subjective matter, I think, because you just have to accept that some people will love this when you love something else.
I mean, and that is the whole point of drinking wine, is having fun, it's having the pleasure, and however you want to have pleasure is your personal business. If you like your red wine chilled for reasons I don't understand, but I don't have to understand. This is your choice. Enjoy it. I still have a friend who likes his dry red wine from the fridge.
Yes.
Doesn't matter how hard I try to explain the science behind it, why it's better, slightly closer to room temperature. You know what? He might be too sensitive for alcohol and he prefers it more chilled. That is his preference, and I am more than willing to accept it, as long as I don't have to drink my Australian Shiraz ice cold.
Yes.
I'm fine with that.
Yes.
But that's how people work in general. And
Yeah.
wine must be a source of pleasure and not a source of stress of how to order it in a restaurant, or how to decant it, or how to just generally enjoy it. It's simple.
Yeah. Well, I think that was a very very good discussion, and thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure. I'll see you for part 2 to continue all this, but
I was going to mention that I might see you for other episodes as well, because I think there's plenty to discuss. I think there are a few episodes which you would be the perfect person to approach with. But thank you very much once again, and thank you everyone who watched this. And if anyone ended with us today, I would highly recommend to press the subscribe button, because it means a lot to me and it means a lot to the podcast. Hopefully it will take off. You know, the little bell icon next to it is there to notify you when I'm putting up another episode. But guys, thank you very much, and have a lovely evening. Thank you, Adam.
thank you so much.
Thank you.